Gangs of the Prohibition era in Chicago. The impact on the Windy City.
Fish in the sea, you know how I feel.
The gangs of Chicago did not begin the corruption during the Prohibition era. There was always corruption, and not just because of the Prohibition Act or the gangsters involved. Immigration was a big impact. It weakened the capability of Chicago's governmental system to operate effectively. Simply during this period, Chicago was the perfect area for this organized crime to expand and grow. Since the encounter, expansion, and exchange of gangs in Chicago impacted the city during the Prohibition era. The National Prohibition Act began in 1919 and ended on 1933. The purpose of this act was to prevent people from consuming more than 1/2 ounce of alcohol. It stated what was and was not allowed to do with alcoholic beverages. To those who broke the law, there were certain penalties when punished them. Exceptions were of course made for farmers who made cider by hardening alcohol, factories who added the alcohol to manufacture products like toothpaste and paint, and many medical purposes. The law had little to any effect on stopping alcohol consumption. By 1925, bootlegging operations were beginning to organize.
The industrialized city caught the attention of many immigrants. People from many parts of Europe, such as Italy, Germany, Poland, and along with American citizens, moved to the opportunistic city in search for work during the year of 1890 until 1914. The result of the mass migration to the city made a high exponential growth in the city's population. This switched the capability of Chicago's governmental system to operate successfully. The number of police officers did not closely match the number of the people in the city, which meant that not everything could be supervised. Violence rates were high. Many of the immigrants' children were exposed to criminal activity starting at a young age. Due to the exposure, gangs molded the minds of young children and gave them a motivation to take part in crimes.
Like many immigrant children during the Prohibition era, one immigrant child that was greatly impacted was Gabriel Alphonse Capone, or Al Capone. As a child in 4th grade, he quit school to help his parents during the struggle for a living in the slums. At a young age, he was able to do more to help. At age 10, he was in charge of bringing home firewood, a useful supplies needed to survive. As he got older, Capone became known as being a smooth dancer, going frequently to a hall then known as Broadway Casino. During those years, another thing he became very known for was being the best pool player in the game-playing section of Brooklyn. Capone throughout his years was very well known for many things. He was never afraid of a fight. He could hold his own against the best of men. Along with being known for normal everyday things, like many children getting influenced, Capone was being taken under Johnny Torrey's wing. Torrey was born on January 20, 1888, and first became well known in New York. He was later called to Chicago to operate and expand Colosimo's chain of brothels. He became a mentor to the young Al Capone. The greedy Torrio decided to ask Capone in Yankee jail to murder Colosimo. After a successful killing, Torrio immediately inherited the mafia empire, expanded big-time bootlegging and gambling. In 1925, Torrio was shot by a rival gang and was gravely wounded. This led to him giving his empire to Capone as he became incarcerated.
Capone's mind was full of excellent criminal thinking. He focused on organizing an international bootlegging ring, the illegal production, distribution, and sale of alcohol. But Capone soon found out that it would not be easy as he had many enemies who despised him. Adelard Cunning, better known as George Bugs Moran, was his biggest rival. Moran was well known for not being afraid of being the leader in a bloody shootout. Moran was very sociable and humorous with the press, making his stories full of sarcastic insults for Al Capone. This escalated to the most cold-blooded gang massacre in the history of the city's underworld. On February 14, 1929, 7 members of the Bugs Moran Northside gang were killed by 4 men, 2 which were disguised as policemen. Later to be found that the men belonged to Al Capone's gang. Neither Moran nor Capone were present in the killing. The police department was greatly shaken and demanded the city and state authorities to call a mass meeting to end the violence.
Corruption in Chicago has always occurred not just during the Prohibition era and not merely because of gangsters. However, problems of organized crime had been in Chicago decades before the Prohibition had even begun. Truth be told, no political, ethnicity, class, or gender group in the city nor its suburbs has escaped the enticement of patronage politics, or the tarnishment of corruption. The Prohibition era simply allowed the gangs of Chicago to gain a large amount of wealth, giving them the ability to bribe those with power. Frequently, gangsters paid off whole waves of police and groups of politicians, making them turn their heads away from their illegal crimes. The law then, most of the time, seemed as unprincipled as the gangsters they sided with. Those government officials who were not corrupt were usually found without power in fighting the activities of the gangs of organized criminals. While no mayor has ever been found guilty for illegal activities, multiple have been entangled in questionable campaign practices and corruption scandals. Some include Republican mayoral candidate Fred Busey, who ran 1907 to 1911, was blamed of distributing jobs, money, and coal from his coal company in exchange for votes during the 1907 election. During 1915, Mayor William Hill Thompson, who ran from 1915 to 1923, then again in 1927 to 1931, rejected the request of Mary McDowell, head of the settlement house, to place an experienced woman as the Commissioner of Public Welfare. He did actually place a woman, not one with public welfare experience, but a loyal Republican Party worker, Louise Osborne Rowe. In a year, she was forced to quit after being held accountable for operating a kickback scheme in the welfare department. Although the prohibition did not cause the crimes, it did permit it to grow, with the gangsters influencing others like the police force and the politicians, while uncorrupted government officials did not have much control. It's not that corruption began here, it's that the gangs of the city made Chicago realize how corrupted the city was, in return impacting it and changing it for the better.
Chicago's police department has always had a very dreadful past. Just like the politicians, they were corrupt. When gangs and bootlegging grew, it changed law enforcement and its ways. They became more corrupt, more than criminals and politicians were, which they all together made lawlessness in the Windy City. Some of those in the law did try to lower crime rates in Chicago. During these years, there was a questionnaire, and it concluded that more than 100% of the police were trying to stop gang crimes. So in 1928, law enforcement officials in Chicago had a conference to talk about new prohibition laws on gangsters. They created the Jones Law. This was more of a punishment towards the gangsters. The law states that any gang member found with alcohol will be sentenced 5 years in prison. The Jones Law didn't stop gangs, but only increased the amount of robberies and alcohol trafficking. Situations in Chicago were getting worse. Years later, in November of 1930, the law enforcement decided a campaign against crime. During the campaign, Assistant Attorney General William J. Orlick went to help George E.Q. Johnson to organize the city's federal services to be able to demolish the city's crime. Also, Washington, D.C. sent more investigators to Chicago to help those attorneys organize the city's federal services. They decided to create groups in the federal services. Some of the names were the Prohibition Forces and the Department of Intelligence Unit, which help enforce more agents. These agents would go undercover to find bootleggers and speakeasies. Speakeasies were forbidden liquor stores or even nightclubs. All the laws created applied to those in the federal services as well. If a police captain was found that he was bribed by bootleggers, they were prosecuted as accomplices. They would check their accounts for how much money they had to be able to accuse them of tax fraud as well. Many say gangs were the cause of corruption. They took part in many of the problems, but the real cause was the law enforcement, which were involved in committed crimes like bootlegging.
In the city of Chicago, corruption has always been a problem, even decades before the Prohibition. The encounter, expansion, and exchange of gangs in Chicago had a great impact in the city during the Prohibition era. During this time, immigrants would come into the city of Chicago, lowering the governmental system more than it already was. The immigration brought expansion and increased numbers of gang crimes to Chicago. Also, the amount of law enforcement increased. The Prohibition era allowed gangs of Chicago to gain a bunch of wealth and be able to bribe those in power. All of this allowed Chicago to realize how corruption in the city truly was. This realization impacted and changed the city for the better many years later.